Wyoming Territory, December 1879. The snow came down hard, fast and thick, and by the time Oliver Westbrook spotted the figure stumbling through the trees, it was nearly dark. He reined in his horse, heart thudding. The woman moved slow, like her limbs were frozen stiff. Her coat was torn at the shoulder, and her hands were bare. She was not dressed for the cold. Not for this kind of cold. Oliver slid down from the saddle before she even saw him. "Ma'am," he called, voice sharp in the quiet. "Stop right there. I do not mean you harm." She froze, swayed, then turned her pale face toward him. Her lips were cracked, cheeks raw from wind, and her eyes wide and wild locked on his. "I am not going to hurt you," Oliver said again, holding up both gloved hands. "I have a cabin just past this ridge. You need warmth. Come on." For a second, she looked like she might bolt. But then her knees buckled, and she sank hard into the snow. Oliver ran to her, catching her just as she started to fall forward. Her body was light from hunger, trembling from cold. As he lifted her, she let out a choked breath and whispered, "Please, do not leave me." "I am not going anywhere," he said, already pulling the spare blanket from his saddlebag and wrapping it around her. He got her on his horse, mounted behind her, and kept one arm around her the whole ride back. She was barely conscious when they reached the cabin, a small, rough-hewn place tucked into the pines, but she stirred when he carried her inside and set her near the stove. Oliver stoked the fire high, lit the lanterns, and poured hot water into a basin. He worked fast, stripping off her wet clothes, replacing them with a dry flannel shirt and wool socks. He tried not to look too long at her bruised ribs or the angry red scrape across her hip. She winced but said nothing. "You are safe now," he said, his voice gentler. "You are inside. I am Oliver Westbrook. What is your name?" She blinked up at him, dazed. "Geneva," she said after a long pause. "Geneva Dorsey." He nodded. "You warm enough?" She gave a small nod, then curled tighter under the quilt he laid over her. Oliver made her tea, then soup. She sipped both in silence, her hands still shaking. She would not look at him long, but when she did, he saw the fear in her eyes and something else underneath it. Grief. Deep and settled. He waited until she had finished the soup before asking, "What happened to you, Geneva?" Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I was with a wagon train. We left Laramie 2 weeks ago. The man leading us, he said we would make it to Rawlins before snow hit. He was wrong." Oliver listened, quiet and still. "We got caught in a storm near Elk Mountain. Everything went wrong. 2 wagons tipped. Horses froze. A few men took supplies and rode off. My brother. He died the first night." Her voice cracked. "I do not know how many made it out. I walked for 3 days." Oliver swallowed hard. "You are lucky to be alive." "I do not feel lucky." He did not have an answer for that, so he just nodded and tossed another log into the stove. That night, he gave her the bed and slept in the rocker by the fire. She did not argue, just curled up under the thick quilts and turned her face to the wall. The next morning, she was quiet but stronger. She helped him mend the fence around the corral, her movements stiff but steady. The sun was out, and the worst of the storm had passed. "You live out here alone?" she asked, wrapping twine around a split post.
"For now," he said.
"I am a ranger. I patrol the upper valleys. Keep the peace where there is none." She looked at him then, her brow furrowing. "You do not seem the type." "What type is that?" She shrugged and turned back to the fence. He chuckled. "I took the badge after my brother was killed in Cheyenne. I figured someone had to stand between good people and the ones who take from them." Geneva was quiet a long time. "I used to think that way too. That someone would come. That someone would help." Oliver paused. "And they never did?" She looked up at him. "Not until now." That night, she lingered near the fire after supper. Her hair was still damp from washing, and he noticed the way she watched the flames, hands folded in her lap. "You planning to head to Rollins when you are strong enough?" he asked. "I was," she said slowly. "But I have no money. No family left. No idea what I would do once I got there." He leaned forward. "You could stay here a while. Until you figure things out." Geneva met his gaze. "Why are you being kind to me?" Oliver hesitated. "Because you needed help."
And because.
"I know what it feels like to lose everything." She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. "I will stay."
For a little while.
Days passed. They fell into a rhythm, chopping wood, boiling coffee, tending the traps Oliver had set along the treeline. Geneva was quiet, but she started to smile more. She laughed once, a surprised, warm sound that made Oliver's chest ache in a way he had not felt for years. He caught himself watching her sometimes. The way her hands moved when she kneaded dough. The way she stood outside at dusk, eyes closed, face turned to the wind like she was listening to something far away. One evening, as they played checkers by lantern light, she looked up and said, "You are not what I expected." "Is that a good thing?" "I think so," she said, smiling. Later that night, as she stood near the stove brushing out her hair, she said softly, "I feel like I can breathe again." Oliver met her eyes. "Then I will keep this place warm until you can breathe easy." She stared at him, her lips parting just slightly. And for the first time since she had arrived, she stepped across the room without hesitation and touched his hand. The snow had crusted over by morning, thin ice glinting on the roofline and along the rails of the porch. Oliver tightened the cinch on his saddle while Geneva stood by the corral, arms folded inside her borrowed coat. She was watching the ridge, not him. "I'll be back before dark," he said, adjusting his rifle in the saddle scabbard. "There's a homestead west of here, old couple. Need supplies. I promised to check on them after the storm." Geneva nodded without looking at him. "Be careful." Her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there the day before, something he couldn't name but felt settle between them. He hesitated before mounting. "You sure you'll be all right here?" "I am. I can keep the stove going." She glanced at him then. "And I know how to use that shotgun by the door if I have to." He gave a short nod and rode out, the crunch of hooves swallowed quickly by the forest. By the time Oliver returned, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the snowpack. The cabin windows glowed faintly, and smoke curled steady from the chimney. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat, and stopped short. Geneva had moved the rocker closer to the fire. A small pot simmered on the stove, and the room smelled faintly of sage and dried onion. She looked up from her knitting something made of coarse gray wool and gave a quiet, cautious smile. "I found the yarn in that chest near the window," she said. "Hope you don't mind." He hung his coat by the door. "I don't. I didn't even know it was in there."
"I figured," she said.
There was dust on the lid thick as a book's spine. He stepped closer, glancing at the pattern in her hands. "You always knit?" he asked. "Used to.
My mother taught me."
I'd sit on the porch with her in the evenings, before the war. He pulled off his gloves and crouched beside the stove to warm his hands, unsure how to respond. She hadn't mentioned her mother before. "I think I forgot how much I missed it," she added. He turned to her. "Missed what?" "Making something with my hands. Something quiet. Something that stays where you put it." She met his eyes, and he saw the flicker of memory. They're not the kind that breaks a person, but the kind they carry forward. Later, after supper, she brought out a worn deck of cards she'd found tucked behind the flower bin. They played by lantern light, no words for a while, just the shuffle and slap of paper on wood. "You always keep to yourself?" she asked, not looking up from her hand. "You mean out here?" "I mean in general." He considered. "Most folks don't stay long. Drifters, miners, trappers. They pass through, they move on. Gets easier not to expect much." She placed a card, slow and deliberate. Still seems lonely.
Sometimes it is.
She studied him for a beat, then quietly said, I'm not passing through. He didn't answer right away. Just set his cards down and leaned back, watching the fire. I know. Days stretch long, but not empty. Geneva took over the baking sourdough biscuits with molasses, thin Johnny cakes fried crisp, and Oliver didn't complain. She mended his second shirt without being asked and left it folded on the straw mattress one morning. He started bringing her back odd things from his rounds. A pine cone shaped like a star, a smooth stone the color of river smoke, a packet of dried currants from a trader near Medicine Bow. In the evenings, she read aloud from an old issue of Harper's Monthly she'd found beneath a floorboard. She did the voices, two stiff British detectives and weeping governesses, and he laughed more than he meant to. One night, after the fire had burned low and the lamp cast a golden ring around their chairs, she lowered the magazine and said, You ever think of leaving this place? He looked up from the piece of leather he was oiling. Not really. Even when the storms come in and the rivers freeze solid? Even then. She pressed her lips together, thoughtful. I used to think I'd end up in a city. St. Louis, maybe. But now I can't imagine sleeping anywhere that isn't quiet. He nodded slowly. Some noise never leaves you, no matter how far you run. She folded the magazine and set it on the table. You ever think about what comes next? Oliver met her eyes, steady. I do now. That night, she didn't go straight to bed. She lingered by the stove, hands resting on the back of a chair. He stood across from her, unsure what to say, unsure what she needed. I think I've stopped feeling afraid, she said, voice low. I don't know when it happened.
Just.
Somewhere between that first morning and now. He stepped closer. It wasn't just the fire. No, her eyes flicked up to his. It was you. He reached for her hand, slow, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers curled into his.
Warm. Alive.
I'm not going anywhere, he said. She nodded once, then leaned into him. Quiet, sure. And in the hush between their heartbeats, something shifted. Not sudden, not sharp, just the beginning of something steady. Something that would hold. Come January, the land turned brittle under the weight of deep freeze. The trees cracked like bones in the night, and the pump handle had to be coaxed each morning with boiled water before it would give. Geneva had taken to walking the edge of the tree line just after sunrise, her boots crunching over old snow while Oliver hauled feed to the horses or checked the snare lines a half-mile west. One morning, as she returned with a bundle of dried pine boughs, she caught sight of him bent over a fallen branch, his coat dusted with frost, breath rising in plumes. Something about the set of his shoulders as he worked quiet, certain made her pause. She stood a moment longer than needed, then turned and went back inside. That afternoon, Oliver brought in a pair of snowshoe hares and laid them out on the chopping block behind the cabin. Geneva joined him without a word, rolled her sleeves, and reached for a blade. You ever dress game before? He asked, not unkindly. Only birds. And once a goat. He gave a brief nod and showed her how to cut behind the legs, how to pull the hide clean in one motion. She worked in silence, hands steady, not looking away even when the smell rose up sharp. I was going to be a midwife once, she said after a pause. He looked over, surprised. My mother apprenticed with one in Missouri. Before we left, I learned herbs, poultices, how to bind wounds and ease fevers. I was 16, the first time I helped deliver a baby. You never told me that. You never asked. Oliver set his knife down. You think you'd still want to do that? Geneva glanced up, mouth tightening slightly. I don't know. Every plan I had went to ash. He didn't press. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and distant cold. They finished in silence. That evening, Geneva brought out a tin box she hadn't opened since arriving. She placed it on the table with care and lifted the lid to reveal a folded swatch of blue calico and a silver hair comb, its edge chipped. "I thought I'd lost this," she murmured, brushing a thumb across the fabric. Oliver leaned forward. "Yours." "My sister's. She wore this dress the day we left Independence. Said the color made her feel brave." "I didn't know you had a sister." "She died near Fort Bridger. Fever took her before the snow ever came." Oliver didn't speak, only watched her as she folded the fabric again and closed the lid. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said finally. "I know," she replied, voice low. "That's the first thing I've known in a long while." The next morning, they rode out together. Oliver needed to check a trail marker that had gone missing after the last windstorm. Geneva rode behind him on his second mare, her scarf tied tight beneath her chin and her borrowed boots stuffed with wool rags for warmth. They stopped by a frozen creek just before noon. The marker, a strip of rusted tin nailed to a pine, had blown loose and hung crooked. Oliver dismounted and fixed it while Geneva walked the creek bank, eyes trailing the frozen water. "There's wild onion beneath the snow," she said softly. "You can smell it if you kneel close." He looked over at her, the way her breath turned the air to fog. "You remember everything," he said. "I tried not to. For a long time." They rode back slower, the sun low behind them. At the cabin, she slid from the saddle and stood a moment, looking at the roofline. "Do you think things settle when you stop running?" she asked. He stepped down beside her. "I think they start to heal." That night, she didn't go to bed early. Instead, she brought the tin box to the table again and pulled out 2 sprigs of dried sage from the bottom. "For protection," she said. "Mama used to tuck it into door frames. Said it kept harm from settling." She handed him one. "You should have it." He took it carefully. "Only if you keep the other." She nodded, and something in her expression, tender, sure, shifted into place. She reached for his hand again, but this time she didn't stop with just a touch. "I want to stay," she said. He looked at her, steady and certain. "Then stay. Not because you've nowhere else to go, but because this is where you want to be." Geneva stepped closer. "It is." And when he bent to kiss her, there was no rush, no firestorm, just the quiet meeting of 2 people who had come through the cold and found something solid in its thaw. By February, the storms had thinned, but the cold held firm. The snow no longer fell in sheets, but lingered in drifts along the northern slopes and shaded gullies. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer than it had been in months, and not only from the stove. Geneva had begun tending a small basket of dried roots and folded cloths she kept near the hearth. She lined them up on the table each morning. Angelica, yarrow, horehound, and spent long hours sorting and grinding, her fingers stained from bark and ash. She didn't explain at first, and Oliver didn't ask. But one afternoon, as he returned from hauling water, he found her bent over the table, stitching a narrow band of linen into a sachet. "Do you remember the boy from the homestead?" she asked without looking up. "The one with the cough?" He nodded, pulling off his gloves. "Travis. Barely 9. She tied off the thread and set the sachet aside. "I'd like to ride out there tomorrow. I've made something that might help." Oliver poured water into the basin near the stove. "That's a long ride," he said. "Even longer back." "I know how far it is." He paused, drying his hands. "All right, we'll go together." She looked up. "You don't have to come. I want to." The next morning, they saddled the horses before sunrise. The trail was narrow along the ridge, and the wind had carved deep hollows in the snow. Geneva rode ahead for a stretch, her posture upright, her scarf tucked tight around her neck. Oliver watched how she moved now, not cautiously, but with the kind of steadiness that came from knowing she had reason to return. The boy's mother met them at the door of the sod house, her eyes red-rimmed and grateful. Inside, The child lay curled beneath a quilt, his breath wheezing shallow through cracked lips. Geneva knelt beside him, her voice soft but firm, and set the sachet in a bowl of warm water, letting the steam rise. "You'll sleep easier tonight," she said to the boy, dabbing his brow with a damp cloth. "And tomorrow, you'll want broth." Oliver stood in the doorway, watching her work. The mother pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed, and he turned away to give them both the space they needed. They rode home in the amber dusk, hoarfrost glittering on the bare limbs of the cottonwoods. Geneva drew her mare alongside his. "You didn't ask why I brought the herbs," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She glanced over, something like quiet approval in her eyes. "Most men I've known don't wait for permission. I'm not most men." "No," she said. "You're not." That evening, she added a new shelf above the stove and lined it with the remaining roots and bundles. She worked without speaking, but her presence filled the room like a second fire. Oliver watched her from the corner, working a new patch into his saddlebag. After a while, he set it down. "You ever think about starting over, proper?" he asked. "Not just surviving building something." She turned to him, brows drawn. "I think about it every day now." He stepped closer, but didn't touch her. "I've got land. Not much, but it's mine. South of the ridge. Soil's better there. Could plant come spring." Geneva looked at him, and something in her expression went still. "You mean for a garden?" she asked. "For more than that." She didn't answer right away, just walked to the window and looked out at the dark trees. "I never pictured myself staying in one place," she said. "But I never pictured someone waiting for me, either." He crossed the room slowly. "I'm not waiting," he said. "I'm here." Geneva turned. She didn't smile, but her gaze softened. "Then I'm here too." And when she reached for him this time, it was with both hands certain, sure, and without fear. Oliver pulled her close, and they stood there in the quiet, the wind tapping gently at the window pane, the kettle hissing low on the stove. Outside, the snow began to melt in slow, secret drips from the eaves. The deep cold had not left the land, but something warmer had taken root beneath it. And neither of them looked away. The first thaw came in early March, subtle as breath. The snow receded in patches along the southern slope, revealing dark soil and pale, bent grasses beneath. The sound of dripping filled the silence between chores, and in the stillest hours of morning, the roof creaked with slow release. Geneva stood at the edge of the pasture fence, sleeves rolled, wrists damp with mud. She had been clearing the trough with a flat-bladed hoe, nudging out the ice and leaf rot that had settled there through the deep winter. Oliver came up behind her with a leather bucket in hand and stopped when he saw her smiling at something in the distance. "Those geese have come back," she said, pointing with her chin toward the far sky. "Same ones, maybe." Oliver followed her gaze. "Could be. They always return to the same water if they can." "They remember," she said, resting the hoe against the fence. "Even after all that distance." He stepped beside her. "You thinking of going somewhere, Geneva?" She shook her head, eyes still on the clouds.
"No."
"I just like that they come back to what they know." He stayed quiet, watching her hands. The right one had a small cut on the knuckle, recent. Beneath her nails was earth. She had started to hum sometimes, not full songs, just quiet threads of melody while she worked. He never interrupted her when she did. Back inside, she spread out the seeds she had bartered from the old man in town. She'd returned with more than she'd set out for: beans, squash, and a few paper packets of tobacco leaves. She arranged them in neat rows on the table, lips moving as she counted. Oliver stood by the door, unbuckling his belt to hang over the peg. "You planning to put all that in the ground at once?" "I was thinking to start along the southern fence. That soil's warmest already. I can mark rows with ash." "You'll need help." She looked up. "I wasn't going to ask." He crossed the room and rested his hands on the table's edge. You don't have to. She touched a seed packet, tracing the printed letters. I didn't think I'd ever want to plan for a season again. But now I'm thinking about cover rows and whether we'll need to fence out deer.
We will, he said.
And we'll need to keep watch for frost through April.
She nodded, then paused.
When I was a girl, I used to dream about a garden with rows, so straight you could lay a string down them.
My sister used to tease me.
Said, I'd marry a man with dirt under his nails. Oliver leaned in. You've got dirt under yours. I noticed, she said, grinning. The next morning, they worked side by side, turning soil with spades Oliver had repaired the week before. The sun warmed their backs, and a hawk circled overhead. Geneva wore a strip of cloth tied around her wrist, where that cut had opened again.
She didn't mention it, and he didn't ask.
By the end of the second week, the first green shoots showed. She crouched over them, hands on her knees, eyes bright. It's not much, she said. It will be, he replied. That night, she sat brushing her damp hair by the hearth. He watched the firelight catch in the strands, gold where it dried. She set the brush down and turned toward him. Do you ever think about what it means? She asked. All of this. He shifted in his chair. You mean the land? No, she said, her voice quiet.
This. Us.
What we're doing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I think about it every night when I lie down with you breathing beside me. She looked at him, steady. And I want to build something that holds. Not just this cabin. A life. With you. She stood and crossed the room, barefoot on the worn floorboards. When she reached him, she took his hands and placed them on her waist. You know I don't need promises, she said. I know, he replied, but I'll give you one anyway. She kissed him then, soft and long, her fingers threading behind his neck. There was no hesitation in her touch, no lingering fear, just warmth and a quiet kind of certainty. They married the following Sunday. No preacher rode through the ridge often, but the woman from the homestead came, and her husband too. Geneva wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin, dyed pale with crushed berries. Oliver wore his cleanest shirt, the one she'd mended by hand. They stood beneath the bare branches of the cottonwood, the creek running fast nearby, swollen with melt. The words were simple. The rings were made of braided horsehair until something better could be bought. It was enough. More than enough. After, they shared supper with the homestead family, and Geneva held the boy's hand as he showed her the new whistle he'd carved. The fever hadn't returned. That night, back in the cabin, Oliver pulled her close beneath the quilts. You sure? He asked, voice low. She answered by pressing her palm flat to his chest, over the place where his heart beat steady. I've never been more sure of anything. Years passed. The garden grew, and then expanded. Rows of corn, then potatoes. A henhouse followed. Geneva tended a small still room beside the cabin, drying herbs and roots, teaching expectant mothers from the valley how to ease pain and coax breath. Oliver kept the trails safe, rode less with a rifle and more with a ledger, helping mark land claims and settle disputes before they turned to blood. They planted an apple tree one spring, and when it bloomed the third year, Geneva wept beside it. I didn't think I'd live to see it, she said. You didn't just live, Oliver told her. You built. And she had. In the evenings, they sat on the porch with their hands folded together, watching the light shift over the hills. Their life was not loud. It did not blaze. But it held. Like good land. Like a promise kept. Like the kind of love that starts quiet and stays.